Now let's take a look at tax in a comparative perspective. We compare Singapore with Finland and Sweden. Now, if you look at personal income tax, what Singaporeans pay into personal income tax as a proportion of total revenue is about 10%. This is in comparison to 34% in Finland and 40% in Sweden. Now, if you look at how much Singaporeans pay into indirect tax, we pay 3.5 times more into indirect tax as compared to personal income tax. Whereas in Finland and Sweden, they only pay 1 time more into indirect tax. Now, if you look at how much Singaporeans pay into Social Security or CPF, we pay 3 times more into CPF. Whereas in Finland and Sweden, they only pay 1 time more in Finland and 0.5 times more in Sweden. So oftentimes, Singaporeans are told that we pay low personal income tax, but as we have shown you, Singaporeans pay 3.5 times more into indirect tax and 3 times more into CPF. So what this means is that when you look at how much Singaporeans actually have to pay into tax and CPF, we actually pay 86% into total revenue, whereas in Finland and Sweden, they pay 94% and 97% respectively. So when you look at it, what Singaporeans pay into tax and CPF isn't that too far off from what the citizens in Finland and Sweden pay. But not only do Singaporeans have to pay tax and CPF, we actually have to pay additional out-of-pocket for public goods such as healthcare, education, transport, and retirement. In fact, what Singaporeans have to pay out of pocket is actually almost the same as how much we pay into personal income tax and CPF. However, for Finland and Sweden, they pay next to nothing for utilizing public goods. They actually do not have to spend out-of-pocket expenditure to the extent that Singaporeans have to. So when you add it all up, what Singaporeans have to pay is actually double what we pay into personal income tax and CPF. So let's look at it in terms of monetary value. For personal income tax, Singaporeans have to pay about $2,000 per capita every year. For Finland and Sweden, they have to pay about $10,000 per capita and $15,000 per capita respectively. For Social Security, Singaporeans have to pay about $6,000 per capita. For Finland and Sweden, this is about $7,000 per capita and $6,000 per capita. And when you look at it, what we pay into CPF isn't actually too far off from what the citizens in Finland and Sweden pay into Social Security. So in total, Singaporeans pay about $8,000 per capita into personal income tax and CPF. In Finland and Sweden, this is about $17,000 and $21,000 per capita respectively. In addition, Singaporeans have to pay an additional amount into out-of-pocket expenditure, which is almost equivalent to how much we pay into personal income tax and CPF, which means that Singaporeans have to pay an additional $8,000 per capita into out-of-pocket expenditure. And for Finland and Sweden, they would pay next to nothing for out-of-pocket expenditure because they would be able to access public services for next to nothing. And in total, Singaporeans have to pay $16,000 per capita into tax, CPF, and out-of-pocket expenditure. Whereas in Finland, they would have to pay about $17,000 per capita, and in Sweden, they would pay about $21,000 per capita. So if you look at it, what Singaporeans pay into tax, CPF, and out-of-pocket expenditure isn't exactly too far off. In fact, we pay almost the same amount as what the citizens in Finland and Sweden pay. But let's look at how much we get back in social protection. In Singapore, we get back about $10,000 per capita in social protection. In Finland, the citizens get back $24,000 per capita, and in Sweden, they get back $28,000 per capita. Now, if you include how much Singaporeans pay into indirect tax on top of tax, CPF, and out-of-pocket expenditure, we pay $22,000 per capita. In Finland and Sweden, they pay $27,000 per capita and $36,000 per capita. And if you look at how much the government spends on social protection as a proportion of that, the Singapore government spends only 43%. In Finland and Sweden, their governments will spend 89% and 79% respectively on social protection, which means that the Singapore government is severely underspending on social protection. If the government should spend at the same proportion as what the Finnish and Swedish government is spending, the Singapore government should be spending at least $18,000 in social protection. So what this means is that there is a lost expenditure on social protection of $8,000 per capita that is not coming back to Singaporeans. But the whole tax system is compounded by the fact that Singaporeans also receive low wages. As a proportion of GDP, only 42% of GDP goes into the wages of Singaporeans, whereas if you look at the other high-income countries, the proportion that goes into wages is up to 60% of the GDP, which means that in Singapore, the wage share that Singaporeans are getting back is very low, which is almost 20 percentage points lower than what Singaporeans should be getting. So again, if you look at the monetary figure, the median income earner in Singapore earns $36,000 every year. However, in Finland, they would earn almost 160% more than Singaporeans. The median income earner in Finland would earn $56,000. And in Sweden, they would earn almost 170% more than Singaporeans. The median income earner in Sweden would earn $60,000 every year. Now, as we have mentioned, because Singaporeans pay almost the same amount as what the citizens in Finland and Sweden pay, which means that as a proportion of our wages, we pay 65% into tax, CPF, and out-of-pocket expenditure. In Finland, this is only 47%, and in Sweden, this is only 59%. So what this means is that Singaporeans pay a very high proportion of our wages into tax, CPF, and out-of-pocket expenditure, and our purchasing power is very low. Now, in fact, when you look at how much income Singaporeans actually earn, the richest 1% in Singapore actually earn as much as the poorest 40% in Singapore. And for the richest 5%, they earn as much as the poorest 60% in Singapore. What about for the richest 20% in Singapore? They earn as much as the poorest 80% in Singapore. Now, this is why income inequality is also the highest in Singapore as compared to all the high-income countries. Also, as compared to the other high-income countries, the poverty rate at 26% in Singapore is also the highest among the other high-income countries. Well, then the question to ask is, what if Singaporeans are paid fairly? Now, if Singaporeans are paid fairly, instead of $800, the low-income earner in Singapore would earn $2,800 every month. And for the middle-income earner, instead of $3,000, they would be able to earn $6,000 every month. So the annual income for a low-income earner would be $33,600. And for the middle-income earner, this would be $72,000. And for the high-income earner, this would be $180,000. And when you look at how much Singaporeans have to spend, the low-income earner would spend almost $32,000 every year. The middle-income earner would spend about $40,000 every year. And the high-income earner would spend almost $54,000 every year. So how much would they have left in savings? For the low-income earner, instead of going into debt, they would be able to save almost $2,000. For the middle-income earner, they would be able to save more than $32,000. For the high-income earner, they would be able to save more than $126,000. Now, this is as compared to the current savings that Singaporeans are able to have. Currently, low-income Singaporeans would go into a debt of more than $6,000, whereas if they were paid fairly, they would still be able to save nearly $2,000. For the middle-income earner, currently they are only able to save about $3,000 every year, whereas if they were paid fairly, they would be able to save more than 10 times what they are currently able to save. And for the high-income earner, they would still be able to save the same amount. Now let's assume that Singaporeans would need to buy a car because we need to be able to get around efficiently, especially when we are in families. The mortgage for a car every year is $12,000. And if Singaporeans are paid fairly, you would see that this time, not only do high-income earners get to purchase cars, middle-income earners get to purchase cars as well. And even after for purchasing a car, the middle-income earner would still be able to save $20,000. And for the high-income earner, they would still be able to save more than $100,000.